Exactly 29 years ago, back in April, Nintendo launched the Game Boy, the first handheld games console to achieve mainstream success and a device that undeniably would lay the foundation for today's world of portable gaming. In this first episode of Retro Tech, we're going to talk about exactly how the device got there. The chaotic video game crash of 1983 led to Atari, the former king of the gaming industry's almost decade-long reign, come to a very quick and abrupt end, which bred a new king in the making, Nintendo. Throughout the 80s, the company would go on a series of winning streaks, beating out all competitors in the process. However, it was in the arcades where Nintendo would especially make its biggest impression. When first starting out in this field, however, the company would face drawbacks. The 1979 arcade title Radar Scope, for example, was a huge success in its home market of Japan, but failed upon its release in the US. The game would be dramatically redesigned and re-released as the hit arcade game Donkey Kong in 1981. Designed by a then unknown Shigeru Miyamoto, a game designer for Nintendo at the time, the game introduced Mario to the world, who would go on to become the company's mascot. With more arcade hits including the sequels to Donkey Kong and the 1983 hit Mario Bros., Nintendo quickly became Japan's leading arcade game developer. Also, in 1983 did Nintendo finally decide to take a leap of faith into the world of console manufacturing and created the Nintendo Family Computer, commonly referred to as the Famicom in Japan. The system became hugely successful, quickly outselling its only domestic competitor Sega and their SG-1000 line of consoles. Nintendo also wanted to bring the Famicom over to the US, but unfortunately, in the aftermath of the video game industry crash of 1983, American retailers were not interested in video game systems of any kind. Nintendo would dramatically redesign the Famicom and employ clever wording and accessory usage to have its console cleverly infiltrate the US markets as both a quote-unquote home computer and a toy, never once marketing the system as a video gaming device. The redesigned console was called the Nintendo Entertainment System, known commonly today as the NES. The system's release in 1985 was a huge hit, promoted by the hit game Super Mario Bros. The system reinvigorated the video game markets in the United States and also started the third and last generation of 8-bit consoles, which Nintendo would dominate throughout the rest of the 80s. To end this chapter, we need to talk about one important event that happened in the late 80s, about 1 year before the product we're talking about even came out, which indefinitely replaced Nintendo's position as kings of the gaming industry till this day. That event would be the court case of Atari Games Corporation versus Nintendo of America Incorporated. Now, because there's so much background and legal language to cover in this case, I'm instead going to just summarize it as briefly as I can. Basically, after the video game crash of '83, Atari was broken into two separate companies, one of which was Atari Games, while regular Atari went its own way, focusing on selling various technologies. Atari Games would try to be a direct competitor to Nintendo during some time in the 80s, but ultimately failed. Fearing their ultimate demise and liquidation, Atari Games decided to go with the "if you can't beat them, join them" model. In 1987, Atari became a licensee of Nintendo and gained the rights to make video games for the NES. The terms and conditions, however, strictly controlled Atari's access to the console technology for obvious reasons. This meant that to sell a video game, Atari was required to give the game to Nintendo, and then Nintendo would place the game on cartridges equipped with 10 NES lockout chips and resell them to Atari. This chip was required on games in order to play on an NES, so that unauthorized games would be locked out. This was done so Nintendo could prevent a flood of unauthorized software, also requiring game publishers to purchase their cartridges through Nintendo. The license also contained an exclusivity term that prohibited licensees from creating adaptations of such games for other consoles for a period of 2 years following the first sale. In 1988, Atari obtained the source code for the lockout chips from the US Copyright Office by falsely alleging that a copy of the code was needed in a copyright infringement action, aka a lawsuit. Atari used this copy to develop its own replica of the 10NES, the Rabbit, which generated signals functionally indistinguishable from the 10 NES lockout chip, which was granted by the District Court in California. Atari then asserted copyright misuse to defend against copyright infringement claims. This would prove to be Atari Games' biggest mistake, as Nintendo ended up winning this case in 1992, while Atari would fade into the shadows forever. With another win granted to Nintendo, the 80s coming to a close, and the 90s just on the horizon, it was now time to open the doors for a new product to please the masses. On April 21st, 1989, Nintendo would release the Game Boy in Japan. Gunpei Yokoi, who was known as one of the best employees of Nintendo at the time, had tirelessly worked together with a small creative team on the Game Boy for many years prior. He was primarily credited with the creation of various inventions for Nintendo, such as the Game & Watch series, the game Metroid, and various other knickknacks before Nintendo even really ventured into video games in the first place. A couple years prior to the Game Boy's release, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who was president of Nintendo Japan at the time until stepping down in 2002, estimated that they could push around 25 million units in 3 years. Across the pond, Minoru Arakawa, the Nintendo of America president, said he thought they could push 100 million units, a bold yet overconfident claim. Arakawa knew that it would take more than Mario and The Legend of Zelda to accomplish this goal. The purpose of the Game Boy was to merge the Game & Watch and the Nintendo Entertainment System, two of the largest Nintendo successes, together. The Game Boy would feature the portability of the Game & Watch and the interchangeable cartridge feature of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Arakawa knew that in order to launch the Game Boy, they would have to distribute a success unlike anything before it. He remembered back to a game he experienced in July of 1988, Tetris, created by a Russian named Alexei Pajitnov. In that year, Arakawa had visited an arcade event where he was first shown it. The game had become very popular, and since there were no handheld incarnations of Tetris, Arakawa and a few others from Nintendo of America headed to the Soviet Union to try to start a deal, and a few months before the system launched, Nintendo decided that Tetris would be the big game they would bundle with the console, similar to how Super Mario Bros. Was bundled with the NES. It had become so successful with its addictive pick-up-and-play qualities that it would fit perfectly with the platform. After being released in April in Japan and July 31st in America, the Game Boy became an instant runaway success. Super Mario Land assisted its climb to the top, though Tetris rocketed to the peak, becoming the most played game of all time, even up to this very day. Other games released that year for the Game Boy included Alleyway, Baseball, Golf, and Tennis. Now, let's take a quick look at the specs of the Game Boy. It was the first dedicated 8-bit handheld system from the company using interchangeable cartridges to play many different titles. It featured a 2.6-inch 4-shade LCD and stereo sound through headphones. The button layout was based on that of the Nintendo Entertainment System's controller. It used 4 AA batteries but could also be used with an AC adapter to power the system from a wall socket. Of the many handheld systems to use ROM cartridges, the Game Boy was the most popular of its time. Smart marketing and a trusted brand led the Game Boy to become the most successful handheld platform of its era, despite being the least impressive when it came to technology compared to other platforms like the Sega Game Gear and the Atari Lynx. In this, Gunpei Yokoi has called his design philosophy lateral thinking of whither technology. This meaning that the technology used in the Game Boy was older and cheaper, yet much more well understood. The lateral thinking means that the older technology is used in innovative and intellectual ways to create a greater gaming experience. No doubt the Game Boy was affordable, had a long battery life, and it was bolstered by an impressive software library. Various video games such as Tetris, Super Mario Land, Kirby's Dream Land, and Pokemon games led the system to a very long life, with the original Game Boy being remade various times, the most impressive of which was the Game Boy Color, released in 1998, which gave Game Boy games color graphics compared to the original's only 4 shades of gray. It couldn't be more accurately stated that Nintendo had tapped into a new market and took full advantage of it, creating a legacy that wouldn't fade away anytime soon. So, what was the overall impact of the Game Boy throughout its life? Well, 3 years later, the console sold 7 million more hardware units than expected, with 32 million sold. By 1997, the Game Boy had sold a whopping 60 million units, becoming one of Nintendo's most successful products of all time. The handheld also became Gunpei Yokoi's most successful product of all time as well. In total, the Game Boy, as well as all of its other iterations, has sold 118.6 million units worldwide as of 2018. But don't just let me be the one to tell you just how successful and memorable the handheld was. Of the millions of stories that gamers have shared of times gaming with the device, here are just 3 short ones narrated by my good friends Nick and Rezi, as well as by myself, links in the description below. Enjoy.
First time I saw a Game Boy was in a Japanese magazine a few months before its launch. I didn't understand the words, but I didn't have to. I knew exactly where it was and immediately set about finding the means to import one into the UK where I was living at the time. After much calling around, I finally found a friendly English-speaking exporter who said he'd buy one and send it to me. Good to his word, it arrived a few weeks after the system hit the streets in Japan and was one of the very first in the UK. Everything about it just blew me away. Compared to today's svelte handhelds, the classic Game Boy feels like quite a brick. But back then, it was sensational. A machine that finally enabled you to play real games without having to sit in front of a TV. I took it absolutely everywhere, but played it the most on my 2-hour daily rail commute. I can't tell you how many people asked me what it was I was playing with. Every time I showed it to them, they thought it was absolutely amazing. For me, the killer app was Tetris, and I put many hundreds of hours into that game, mostly going for 9 and high 5 over and over again. I just never got bored, and indeed found it strangely relaxing, a way to focus my mind when it was racing or I was stressing out. I still think that game ranks as one of the all-time greats. From its graphics to its controls, everything about that game was just perfect.
I remember getting the brick for my birthday when I was 7 years old, and I didn't even have a proper console at the time. I regularly had arguments with my mother because she was addicted to Tetris and I wanted to play. We compromised by competing for score in Tetris. She would always win. Now she has a disability and physically can't play it anymore, but I really treasure those memories. Tetris remains very special to me. Looking back, the Game Boy is basically a pocket-sized monochrome NES. It's difficult to state how mind-blowing that was when it first came out. I had, and still have, Capcom's DuckTales on it, and it's such a great low port. The music, the visuals, the gameplay are all intact. Albeit minimized, I still play it to this day, and I'm more comfortable with it than I am with the NES original. This thing was a really significant moment for games, very much like the Walkman was for music. It broadened the audience demographic and took gaming way outside of its usual environment. Stunning.
My love of handheld started early on. My first was a Coleco electronic quarterback that I rarely ever left home with, but would carry all around the house playing it. That trend continued in 1989 when I finally received the Game Boy. I don't even recall how I even heard about the system other than spending a lot of time in the game section of Toys R Us, but getting one for my 9th birthday was terrific. I remember getting Super Mario Land, Alleyway, Baseball, and Tetris along with a black zippered carrying case. I didn't end up playing any of them all that much, mostly due to my short attention span, or running out of batteries. But that didn't stop me from checking out every new game I could find. I ended up with quite a few titles during those first few years. Some of those games included Castlevania, The Adventure, Daedalian Opus, Solar Striker, Bases Loaded, Championship Pool, and Dr. Mario, which my mom became addicted to. It wasn't until I happened across Final Fantasy Legend that I really fell in love with handheld gaming, even though I didn't really like that specific game all that much. Having an RPG on the go with me was fantastic, and I kept at this one until Final Fantasy Legend 2 came out and supplanted it. Final Fantasy Legend 3 and Adventure were also favorites of mine, and the fact that I could play RPGs anywhere was just fantastic. I'd take my system with me everywhere, especially on weekend outings with my grandparents. I'd carry it around the mall, to restaurants, to the grocery store, and anywhere else I was forced to go. I'd sit in the car and play the Game Boy while waiting on my grandparents to finish up their errands or carry it with me instead and find a quiet place to sit and play. Sadly, This was around the same time that I found out that I get carsick when trying to read or play a game in a moving vehicle. Otherwise, I would have played even more on a road trip as well. I eyed other handheld consoles over the years, but none of them really seemed worth it. I did eventually buy a Game Gear, but it went mostly unused. I kept with my Game Boy, eventually upgrading to a Game Boy Color, and then a Game Boy Advanced, and a Game Boy Advanced SP. Sadly, the only Game Boy I still own today is just a Game Boy Advanced SP, but it works and I still play it occasionally. Nintendo, specifically Gunpei Yokoi, are to be thanked for my love of portable gaming. My PS Vita, 3DS, PSP, and DS all still see more action than my consoles, and for that reason, I hope true handheld gaming continues for a long time to come. Without any doubt, Nintendo brought about the portable gaming market. Without them, it wouldn't have matured like it had. Companies back then thought singular games on an electronic device was the way to go. The Game Boy changed everything. It reigned king for nearly 10 years. It wasn't until Nintendo's next handheld, the Game Boy Color, did the original die out. With over 800, that's right, 800 games, it's hard to deny the success Nintendo saw. Game developers from all over flocked to the device. With over 64 million original Game Boys sold during its 10-year lifespan, the first true gaming handheld wowed audiences everywhere and became the most wanted electronic by kids during the 90s. In conclusion, it's safe to say that before Game Boy was invented, mobile games were very basic and not a lot of fun. But Nintendo's beloved gray brick changed all that. Long plane rides and car journeys suddenly became something to look forward to, and at long last, players didn't have to crowd the TV to feed their gaming need. It was a true revolution, and one that had a huge impact on many people's lives.